Morning. Hello, I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove, and welcome to our 173rd step in our walking tour through the Bible. And today we've got to talk about something very important. We've got to talk about tradition. And we're going to talk about tradition looking at Psalm 77, brackets 78, which is a very long psalm. It's used at Easter time and also in Lent on Friday week 4 and Saturday week 4 in the Office of Readings. It stretches over 2 days. It's in 6 parts in the breviary. Now, what is this psalm about? This psalm is about tradition. Now, tradition means two things, okay? It's a good idea for us to have these two meanings separate in our heads. First of all, tradition is that which has been passed on to us by previous generations. In other words, the content of the faith and the practice of the faith. Secondly, tradition is the act by which the content of faith and the practice of faith are passed on. So there's the content of tradition and there's the act of tradition, the passing on. I believe sociologists have a variety of terms for these actions, which I'm not familiar with. Now, here we have the psalm. It starts off, give heed, my people, to my teaching. Turn your ear to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable and reveal hidden lessons of the past. The things we have heard and understood, the things our fathers have told us, these we will not hide from their children, but will tell them to the next generation. The glories of the Lord and his might, and the marvelous deeds he has done, the witness he gave to Jacob, the law he established in Israel. He gave a command to our fathers to make it known to their children, that the next generation might know it, the children yet to be born. They too should arise and tell their sons, that they too should set their hope in God and never forget God's deeds, but keep every one of his commands, so that they might not be like their fathers, a defiant and rebellious race, a race whose heart was fickle, whose spirit was unfaithful to God. And it goes on. And it goes on actually at great length to give us a history of Israel. Now, what this psalm is in its literary form is a summing up of the whole Old Testament from the time of Moses to the time of King David. So it tells us about, let's say, what happened in the desert. Yet still they sinned against him. They defied the Most High in the desert. In their hearts they put God to the test by demanding the food they craved. That was when they were asking for they said there's nothing to eat in the desert, that God sent them manna from heaven. They even spake about God, and so on and so forth. And they said, is it possible for God to prepare a table in the desert? Okay. Then it goes on, more about Moses, and then finally it sort of concludes with, let me just find it, with King David. From the care of the ewes, female sheep, he called him, be shepherd of Jacob his people, of Israel of his own possession. He tended them with blameless heart, with discerning mind he led them. So King David is the climax of this psalm. Although it also talks about various disasters that fall before the Israelites during the time of the judges. Now, the theme of the psalm is the theme of the entire Old Testament. Israel prospers when it's faithful to God, and Israel faces disaster when it does not adhere to God. So the Israelites, in their unfaithfulness, go after the Baals, and the Israelites are punished by war and disaster. The Israelites return to God, and prosperity returns, and they go back to their home, and so on and so forth. But the really important thing here is the act of tradition, the act of handing on. He says, give heed, my people, to my teaching. So the elder, or whoever this is, who's reciting the psalm, who's speaking, is telling people to give heed, to listen to his teaching. He's got some teaching to impart. This is the first thing. The church is a mater et magistra, mother and teacher. Magister, magistra means actually the equivalent of a primary school teacher, the person who teaches you your ABC, the person who teaches you the first things you get to know in school. So the church must present itself as a teacher. Okay, yes, we've heard a great deal in recent times of the listening church, and indeed of the following church, the church following modern trends, and the church learning from modern trends. But the church has also got to propose, and we have got, the members of the church have got to listen. Turn your ear, he says. Now, you're only going to turn your ear, you're going to turn your head and listen out carefully if you think the church has got something interesting and original to say. So that, the words of my mouth. So that is important. The church must present itself as having something original and interesting to say. Now, this will require a degree of courage. I've been very discouraged in various points in my career when I've proposed the church's teaching and had a very hostile reception. And that's very demoralizing, particularly when you know you are right. One of the things I found where I got a very hostile reception was when I talked about the question of internet pornography, which is completely alien to church teaching. It's completely against everything the church stands for. And yet, a whole load of people who are Catholics find any discussion of the church's position on pornography very, very, it's not what they want to hear. The American bishops, incidentally, have produced an excellent letter on the dangers of internet pornography. The reason why people don't want to listen to this message about internet pornography, instead, Matt Fradd, who may be known to some of you, he's on Twitter, has written a very good book about internet pornography. But the reason people don't want to hear about this internet pornography being a bad thing, apart from radical feminists, funnily enough, is that if you condemn internet pornography, you're essentially condemning, because it seems to be part of a package, the sexual revolution. And there are many in the church who want to make peace with the sexual revolution rather than oppose the sexual revolution. They feel that the sexual revolution is not worth opposing, or secretly they're in favor of the sexual revolution. It's just like, for example, in about 1807, there were lots of people in France who said, well, the revolution's happened, we must make peace with the revolution. Whereas, of course, there were some diehards who said, no, no, never. Anyway, that's a parallel, a historical parallel. Now, the church has got to courageously propose its teaching rather than hide its teaching away. The things that we have heard and understood, the things from the past, the things our fathers have told us, okay, the things that Pius V told us, Pius X told us, Pius XI told us, Pius XII told us, these things we will not hide from their children. These words could have been written for us, but we'll tell them to the next generation. In other words, the person who's speaking here is saying, we're not going to be embarrassed about what the rabbis of the past said. We're not going to be embarrassed by what King Josiah taught. We're not going to be embarrassed about what the prophets taught. No, we're going to proclaim it loudly. We're not going to hide it from you, you children. And similarly, we Catholics now must propose the teaching of the church. Now, the teaching of the church has been remarkably constant and coherent over the centuries. It's unwise to pretend that we know better than our forefathers. And it's certainly distressing to hear theologians tell us that what we are proposing now, which seems to be in clear contradiction to what our grandparents believed, is somehow superior to what our grandparents believed. Our grandparents were not fools. Our great-great-great-grandparents were not fools. Today we celebrate St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher. They were not fools. What they believe, we should believe. We mustn't hide this from people today. So, for example, both St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher went to the block because they believed in the indissolubility of marriage. We too propose exactly the same thing in solidarity with them. It's not going to change. There's nothing worse than a theologian who seems to be under the impression that nature and nature's laws lay steeped in night, then God said, let 1968 be, and all was light. There wasn't a sudden Erklärung in the 1960s, and that there wasn't a sudden uh, moment in the 1960s when all theology of the past became essentially outdated and irrelevant. The theology of the past is very relevant today. It must not be hidden from our children. The glories of the Lord and his might, and the marvelous deeds he has done, the witness he gave to Jacob, and the law he established in Israel. Now, of course, our Jewish brethren believe that the law is for all time. Torah is for all time. God has not changed, the law cannot change. We, of course, believe that the law develops but does not change. It remains the same plant. It grows, but it does not change. And simply the life of the people, the life of the church, is something which we find instructive. We will not develop our church life today by denigrating the church life of the past. Rather, we build on the past. Our particular branch is attached to a trunk that has ancient roots. Very important we realize that. Tradition is organic. Tradition grows. When you have a beautiful tree, you don't say, well, we need a better tree. Let's cut down this tree and plant a cutting elsewhere. No, we prune the tree, we cultivate the tree that we've got. And similarly, we are in continuity with all the saints of the past. The reverence we pay to the saints is incredibly important because it is a reverence we pay to the lived faith of those people. We're trying to learn from their lived faith. And the point of all this, so that the future generations, that the next generation might know it, and children yet to be born. Now, it's a well-known fact that the tradition is faltering today. Many, many children of Catholics are no longer Catholic. In other words, parents have tried to pass on the faith, and the faith has not been passed on. We know this very well. Stephen Bullivant has written a very big book about it, the failure to pass on the faith. They too should arise and tell their sons that they too should set their hope in God and never forget God's deeds, but keep every one of his commands. So it's very important the younger generation pass on the faith, but they're not getting the faith. How do we ensure they get the faith? Well, for whoever wrote this psalm, it's very simple. How do you get the faith? You learn this psalm off by heart. You read this psalm. This psalm is a summary of the faith of Israel. And the faith of Israel is the trust that is given to God generation after generation and the reverence of the law. So this psalm, the recitation of this psalm, is the tradition. What is tradition? It is the content of faith. What is tradition? It is the passing on of the faith. What is tradition? It is the act of reciting this psalm. This psalm is, if you like, a mnemonic of tradition. We too need to realize that tradition is an action that happens. We need to do things that pass on the tradition. For them, it was reading this psalm. For us, it's doing things and saying things and passing on things, doing things like the Stations of the Cross, going to Mass, obviously saying the Rosary and so on. These are the actions which will pass on the faith. It's a very interesting psalm, this, so please do read it, and it certainly speaks to the church today. All the best. Bye.